Hello and welcome to this Art and Novel Talk. I'm Lara Wardle, Executive Director of Jerwood Foundation, and I curate the Jerwood Collection. I'm speaking to you from a very dark January early evening in Shropshire. And for those that haven't joined one of these talks before, hosted by Art UK, I'll be talking for about 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions. I'll do my best to answer. It's really a perfect moment to be doing this talk in 2023, as this year marks Jerwood Collection's anniversary year, and it's 30 years since we bought the first work for the collection, a painting by Sir Frank Brangwyn, which was bought by Alan Grieve, Chairman Emeritus of Jerwood. It was bought at Sotheby's in London in 1993. And since that time, the Jerwood Collection, which is a collection of modern and contemporary British art, has outgrown its original home, which was the Foundation's then office building in London. It was on permanent display at the then Jerwood Gallery in Hastings, and it's now become a loaning collection owned by a UK charity with the purpose of enhancing the understanding and enjoyment of 20th and 21st century British art. So we loan our works from the collection both nationally and internationally, and sometimes we loan a single work, or on occasion we loan a group of works to an exhibition, and sometimes we loan a whole exhibition made up from our collection. So an example of how we work with our collection is that we recently concluded a year-long residency at Harley Gallery in Nottinghamshire. And this took the form of 4 distinct exhibitions drawn from our collection. And we worked with different partners for this series of exhibitions, including UK charity Outside In. And for that exhibition, we gave opportunities for their artist curators. And for another exhibition, we worked with local schools, and we enabled both primary and secondary school-age children opportunities to engage with our collection. So in projects that we embark on for Jerwood Collection, we always put the emphasis on enjoyment. And for me, one of the ways that I experience enjoyment when looking at a work of art is thinking about the narrative. And that's either, whether it's conveyed in a particular way through what's depicted, or perhaps it's the narrative that tells me about the creation of a piece. So I really wanted to choose a theme for today's talk, mainly because I thought it would help me pick works to talk about. I find it sometimes difficult to narrow down the works, and on occasion I tend to talk about the same works. Anyway, I have chosen the theme of storytelling, and more broadly looking at narrative in a group of works of art. Narratives and tales really define our cultures and what binds us together, whether as families or communities in any sort of form. And I want to explore this by looking at 6 works in the collection. This first slide has 5 works from our collection, and I'm not going to talk about any of them, but we can always come back to them at the end for the questions. So the first work I want to talk about, finally, is this work by Paula Rego, and I thought this would be a very good place to start when thinking about artworks and storytelling. Really, throughout her career, Paula Rego's work has, had a very strong narrative element. She's fascinated by fairy tales, and part of her lifelong interest in fairy tales came from being told fairy tales by her grandmother. And in turn, she passed her love of fairy and folk tales to her granddaughter. And she created a portfolio of etchings and aquatints called the Nursery Rhyme Portfolio, which she produced in 1989. And this work dates to the same year. And in some ways, when you look at it, it looks like a gathering together of nursery rhymes. There's various animals that you can spot in it. I mean, I really, I love fairy tales and folk tales, and I really love the way that Paula Rego depicts them, and that's because they're really dark and really they have a sort of general sinister undertone. And I think this work's no different. On an initial look, it appears to be some sort of charming scene. There's a group of people and animals that are gathered together under this, starlit sky. And there's an elderly woman, maybe she's a grandmother on the right-hand side, and she's reading a story from a book to two children. And as your eye travels around the work, you notice more groups gathered together. Their heads are bowed towards each other. And, when you look at it, I think you imagine a general cacophony of voices, perhaps they're sort of hushed, whispering as the voices pass from one person to another. And it's not just human voices that I think are implied in this work. You can see in the centre, there's a silhouetted dog on its back legs in the foreground. It's apparently might be howling to the unseen moon. And the dog's accompanied by a cat meowing. And further into the work, you can see this right in the centre, you see a sort of oversized toad, perhaps being piggybacked, and it's opening its mouth into a croak. And there's even a sort of boar with tusks on the right-hand side with its mouth open and possibly grunting. So I think this work, it's partly telling us a narrative about sound, and it's also telling us about how stories are passed from one person to another. Of course, people don't tell stories the same way as each other, and even tell stories the same time each time they tell them. Perhaps they include embellishments, or perhaps they've forgotten part of the story. But there's always probably some change when you tell a story. And I think, it's also very interesting to look at this work and think about how Paula Rego has used the areas of light and dark. And when you sort of spot the areas of light in the work, it's almost as if the stories that are being passed from person to person or coming from the book in the foreground are the sources of light. And it's, of course, through stories that we gain illumination and understanding. So we purchased this work, this print, relatively recently for the collection. We bought it in 2021, and I next, if I can go to the next slide, want to look at a work that we bought in the 1990s. So before I explain why I chose to include this work, I want to just say a little bit about how we've collected works for Jerwood Collection. I mentioned at the start that this year is our 30-year anniversary. And the collection was originally begun in 1993, and it had a sort of purpose of buying modern and contemporary British art for what was then the Foundation's offices in London. And part of the collecting was driven by the chairman's interest in modern British art. And part of the collecting came about through Jerwood's activities within the arts. For example, the Jerwood Painting Prize, which ran from 1994 to 2003. The first winner of the Jerwood Painting Prize, which at the time was the most valuable art prize, British art prize, first winner was Craig Aitchison, and that year in 1994, his painting, The Crucifixion, entered the collection. And shortlisted alongside Craig Aitchison were Maurice Cockrell, John Hoyland, Yuko Shireshi, John Nassau, and Yuan Yuko. And although, unfortunately, we haven't collected works by every winner and every shortlisted artist, much as I would have loved to, we have tried to acquire works by artists that were selected. And this work, The Blue Towel, which was painted in 1982, was bought for the collection in 1998. And I think it holds the record for our most loaned and well-travelled work. But possibly this record has now been overtaken by our Barbara Hepworth. I don't have that type of stat in my stats, but perhaps we should add it. So I've included this work because, it is a figurative painting and it has this immediate implication of narrative, but very unusually, the figure in the work, which was modelled by the artist Liz Barrett, appears 3 times. And the painting conveys this sense of the passage of time within it as we see Liz Barrett in 3 different poses. which relate to her habit of collecting a towel, having a shower, and then leaving. And through including the same figure 3 times, I think Hugo is really drawing attention to the artifice of painting. Of course, when we look at the painting, we know it's not real, and instead some sort of representation of what the artist is looking to portray. However, there can be some sort of suspension of disbelief at times, but there really is, I don't think, any of that in this work. And instead, Hugo invites us to follow the figure on this journey through the work as she collects her towel and then leaves the studio. So the next work I wanted to talk about and look at through this lens of narrative and storytelling is this collage by John Piper, Beach and Starfish, Seven Sisters Cliff, Eastbourne. And he made it, as you can see, 1933 to 34, sort of early 1930s, and it belongs to a very small group of collages that John Piper created depicting the South Coast. And during this time, for a period, he rented a cottage on the edge of the beach at Rye Harbour nearby. And in this group of works, which are in part influenced by contemporary French art, he's used a variety of materials to create the collage. So you can see in the foreground the illustrations, and they're illustrations from scientific textbooks. And there's also included newsprint, and the newsprint that he's included comes from the New Statesman, for which he wrote articles. And this work has a very particular political undertone, as in the news clippings, which he's chosen to sort of define the cliffs. The news clippings actually comment on the rise of Nazism, and of course the cliffs themselves are a natural defence against any future invasion. But in using the printed commentary, he's very much bringing the narrative to the forefront and also locating the work at a particular point in history. And he's even included, you can see, a Union Jack, which reinforces a sense of identity and nationalism. But really, I mean, the collage is not just a political commentary. And I think the overall feel of the work really tells the story of John Piper's appreciation of the English coastal landscape. And he's included a lighthouse, which is very much a necessary part of coastal architecture. And he very much admired lighthouses. And he wrote about his fascination with coastal landscapes in a seminal essay, which was published in the Architectural Review. And I just wanted to read one sentence from it, but it's very brilliant. His essay is called "The Nautical Style," and if you want to look it up, it was published in January 1938. Anyway, the sentence I wanted to read was: "On the coast, waves break and salt foam scatters and denudes. Gales blow stronger and the rain is more searching." Part of the narrative that's conveyed in the work is really how it's been created and how Piper has described the coastal landscape. You have the sea, which has been he's described it with short flicks of the sort of black gouache, and where the waves, there's got a white he's used a white, kind of drawn the paintbrush down with a wavy white brushstroke, and that's just showing where the waves are breaking on the shore. I mean, even when he's left the sort of ground of the paper, tells the story and defines different parts of the work. So moving back in time to 1913 is this self-portrait by Dora Carrington. It's another relatively recent acquisition, and definitely one of my favourite works in the collection. In case anybody was going to ask in the Q&As, this is definitely it. Carrington, as she preferred to be known, painted this remarkable, and it's really incredibly rare, self-portrait just when she was at the end of her time at the Slade School. And she was at the Slade with a very talented generation of artists. They all studied together. It included Stanley Spencer, Paul Nash, David Bomberg, William Roberts, Mark Gertler, amongst others. It's a very intriguing work. As being a self-portrait, it makes me think about how we present ourselves to the world. You know, that's in itself a narrative that we construct, from the clothes we wear, to how we stand, how we, you know, if we have our haircuts, to what we say. You know, perhaps a self-portrait is how we want to be seen rather than how we might actually be seen. And there's a really, I think, a fascinating disconnect revealed in this work between how I think of as Carrington, and certainly how she appears in photographs, contemporary photographs, with her head bowed and her fringe almost hiding her eyes, which gives her the appearance of being a rather shy and self-effacing individual. And the comparison of that with this bold statement of a young female artist, and she's dressed in probably what might be a man's striped shirt and these oversized trousers, and it's quite it is a very bold statement for the early decades of the 20th century, and you have to think back to really what it would have been like for her living in such a male-orientated world. You know, she would have faced many prejudices, and really she challenged the notions of her gender, cutting her hair short, discarding her Christian name, and wearing clothes that would have probably raised eyebrows in post-Edwardian London. I mean, Carrington's been rather sidelined historically in the story of 20th century British art, and there's now a real resurgence of interest in her work. We were really delighted to have the opportunity to buy this work in 2020, as Carrington felt like a missing link in the Jerwood Collection, and we hold so many works by her contemporaries, and we also have a number of self-portraits in the collection. I think there's a huge relevance in showing this work to a contemporary audience. Looking at this work may prompt people to think about women and people and challenges they've faced and continue to face. And it might prompt people to think about how we see ourselves, that we should definitely wear what we want to, that we shouldn't feel the need to conform, and that to be different is definitely to be celebrated. When I was thinking about the theme of storytelling for this talk, it felt really fitting to include a work by Michael Airton. So we have 5 works in our collection, 3 sculptures and 2 paintings. And all of them have this sort of feeling of mystery about them, as if there's something to be uncovered. Michael Airton, he was a sort of multifarious artist, and as well as being a painter and sculptor, he was a critic, broadcaster and novelist, and he also worked as a stage and costume designer. He declared that we live by myths, and much of his work reveals a sort of obsession with myths and mazes. This sculpture, Oracle 1, which was cast in an edition of 6 and dates from 1962, it really felt particularly appropriate to choose for this talk, as it depicts, as you can see, a female oracle, and she's leaning forward to impart her divine prophecy. You know, you see her one arm is across, resting on her thigh, and the other one behind her for balance as she leans so far forwards. So the word oracle derives from the Latin word to speak, and it's, you know, generally used to refer to female priestesses who are believed to speak knowledge imparted to them from the gods. I mean, unfortunately, this piece slightly reminds me of the brilliant piece by William Kentridge in the recent RA exhibition, Sybil, where you have the Sybil write all the answers to people's questions. You know, but they're blown about by the winds, and people can't really tell, you know, which answer is meant for which person. And really, unfortunately, for people who sought the oracle's advice, it was often delivered in riddles, and it was left for the applicant to decipher. And I suppose for me, sculpture seems to convey a warning that narratives are slippery things and storytelling isn't really a straightforward concept, as we might think. And that rather very neatly brings me on to the final work that I wanted to talk about, which is this work by Barbara Walker, Vanishing Point 13 Veronese. And again, another recent acquisition. We bought it in 2021. Actually, you can see it, hopefully you can see it on your screen. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to see the definition of the embossed paper on the left-hand side of the work, but hopefully you can see it. This work's part of an ongoing series of drawings in which Barbara Walker explores the presence of Black subjects in Western European painting. And she takes inspiration from historic paintings by artists such as Titian, and in this case Veronese, and others, and she makes these incredible graphite drawings on the embossed paper. And they're absolutely sort of exquisite drawings, but they really raise questions about what is seen and what is unseen, and about how different people have been portrayed in paintings, and about how narratives have been told to us through those works. And she really brings, as you can see in this work, to the forefront characters and people who've been marginalized and often ignored. And she asks us to look again and ask what we might have missed before. And for me, this work is about how there's always more than one narrative. And again, how storytelling can become problematic if we're just handed down a story from one perspective. And again, I think thinking back to the Paula Rego work at the beginning, there you have lots of different people telling different stories, even the dog howling and the toad croaking. You know, and perhaps it's better to have all those different viewpoints rather than one viewpoint. Thank again Art UK for hosting, and thank you all for joining.